Where and how you physically cast your vote influences the policies and the people that you vote for in an election. I know, it sounds like a stretch, but it's true. And I'm not talking about the influence of regional bias either, like north or south or urban or rural. I'm talking about the building layout and the space where the polling is done. To understand how, let's say you're voting in the 2000 general election. You live in Arizona, and your neighborhood's assigned polling place is the local high school. It's only about half a mile away from home, so that's great. You'll head over on your lunch break. The parking lot's not so bad. You park, get out, follow the signage inside. Along the way, you wade through some of the students that are attending class here. You pass by some old lockers and maybe a trophy case or something like that. It's awfully hard not to reminisce about your high school days when you're here, for better or worse. The signs then point you toward the gym where you're greeted by two different people that are sitting at a table. You show them your ID and then they hand you a card filled with lines and numbers on it. That's your ballot, and you take it with you to an open booth. Inside there, you find instructions for how to insert your ballot card into the holder. This holder keeps it just in the right spot so that one single row is revealed, while it stays fixed in place, while the information on different cards with arrows indicates which box corresponds to which vote. One choice that you're asked to make in this election is something called Proposition 301. If you vote no, nothing happens. If you vote yes, your state sales tax will go up from 5 to 5.6%. And the increased revenue is going to go towards supporting schools and education. As you ponder your choice, something has actually happened to you, and it began before you even finished parking your car. It occurred without you even knowing it, and it operates at a subconscious level, so you never will. Being at the high school building and the sight of the students and lockers and everything activates a part of your brain that processes how schools work and what they expect from you while you're there. This is true even if you're not a student or you don't even have kids. Psychologists call it context priming, and it describes when spaces and objects around you have an influence on the way that you behave. Priming helps you predict the kinds of things that you might encounter in the future. And it works so that you're prepared for what's to come, and you're able to respond more quickly and have better precision in your responses. But it also helps to put you in a certain mindset that prepares you for how to behave inside of certain contexts. For instance, if you're perusing a supermarket, shopping for wine, you're more likely to buy French wine if there's French music playing. You're just more attuned to the things that you associate with the cues that you're gathering from your surroundings, like the sights and the sounds around you. When you walked into the school, you were reminded of what schools do. You're reminded about the existence of children and what they're like, and you recognize that you too were once a student. You are unconsciously reconstructing in your head, or maybe even adopting the construct that schools enforce. So if you're asked whether or not you think schools should be receiving more support, you're more likely to vote yes when polled from a school. Psychologists studied the data from this very election, and they found that the effect yielded 2% more yeses from people voting from any other type of building. But those locations, they're assigned basically randomly. It's not as though people who like schools vote from schools. They also accounted for the possibility that the people with kids live near schools. The only thing accounting for that 2% difference is priming. I also realize that 2% probably doesn't sound like all that much, but most elections are decided by margins that are way smaller than that.
As of now, the official position is that George Bush is ahead by 300 votes.
The presidential race that year, it came down to 0.5%.
If the two campaigns agree on one thing, it is that this race will be decided by a handful of voters in a handful of states.
And theoretically, I think any influence is way too much here. In an ideal democratic process, how citizens are polled would have zero effect on their choices. It should be a fully transparent process, meaning that it has no impact on the data or the outcome of the decision. So 2% impact, it's a big deal. In 2000, there were just shy of 200,000 locations for voting in the United States, and they're all not made equal, because that's simply just an impossible task. But these buildings become the primary location as the most important way that citizens engage the democratic process as a whole. Not the White House, not the Capitol, not the National Mall, but instead it's where people play bingo on Sunday, or listen to a sermon, or play varsity basketball when they were in high school. All that's percolating. Let's go back to that Arizona example and look at how we're registering our vote. Inside of the booth, hanging from a chain, is a sharp metal object with a handle. It looks like a mini screwdriver or something. It's called a stylus, and it's for pressing the metal end through the ballot, forming a hole where the arrow says corresponds to the way you want to vote. You turn the pages, which reveal and align different areas of your ballot. And then after punching all of your holes and removing your ballot, you hand it to an election worker that slides it into a machine that counts it, and you're done. Presumably, the machine counted your vote, but how confident are you that it worked? Or that it even counted your vote accurately? Voter confidence is one of the most important factors that drives the design of the entire voting process.
Every registered voter deserves to have confidence that the system is fair and elections are honest, that every vote is recorded, and that the rules are consistently applied.
The system that we use to just cast our vote for Prop 301 is called punched card system, and specifically the Vote-O-Matic. It's a great name. It was the most popular method for voting in 2000. And it replaced the mechanical lever machines, which had been used since almost around the 1920s. Today, majority of votes are cast using the optical scan method, where a pencil mark on a ballot is read by an optical reader machine. These are all forms of the Australian ballot method adopted in the mid-19th century here in the US. That's the format where your vote remains a secret in order to prevent voter intimidation and ensure privacy. Before this, you might have just yelled out your vote in a tavern or something like that. But because all these recent methods adopt this Australian ballot formula, they kind of all look alike from a distance. Small booth standing on little spindly legs with privacy screens. Their flat pack design, meaning that they fold up flat, means that they can be transported easily inside of what's called an election supply carrier. And they can also be set up really quickly in a variety of room shapes and sizes. While each system looks similar, using them, totally different story. Small details govern whether people feel confident while they're voting or not. For instance, people used to love those old lever machines because you would set your vote with these physical knobs and you'd pull this really satisfying lever when you were done. The weight and noise of all the mechanical action gave people confidence physically that their vote was being counted accurately. Ka-chunk! But in reality, they're not all that accurate as a system. The interface, it appeared really simple, but there were hundreds of little gears inside that made it all work. If anything went wrong in there, it would register incorrectly and no one would know until it was too late. Its replacement, the punch card method, it came down to its tragic downfall in that 2000 election when the presidential race came down to tens of thousands of contested ballots in Florida. Folks just weren't jabbing it right, and the resulting ambiguity was an embarrassing failure that undercut confidence in the entire voting system across the country. Without trust or confidence that our elections are producing fair outcomes, voters just stay away from the polls. And this compromises the sense of legitimacy that they have in their government. Today's optical method, interestingly I think, does leave voters with confidence because they believe they're accurate. But the whole process just sucks a little bit more than the other methods. The instructions for them feel less clear and satisfying, and they lead to longer wait times overall, 11.6 minutes on average. So citizens rate voting like this as more awful than other methods. So in addition to instilling confidence in the voter, I think that where we vote and how we vote should also be accompanied by things like convenience and usability as we assess our spaces. For the optical scan method, it all kinds of evens out. It's less pleasant, but it's also pretty accurate. But the voting booth, it's only one component of an entire ecosystem that can be rated on all these factors. A frustrating voter experience can be tacked up to things like poorly maintained spaces, inadequate exterior lighting, low visibility, if the building isn't visible from roadways, lack of signage, broken voting machines, no restrooms, or lack of parking. These all add up to about 4.6 lower voter turnout based on the physical conditions of the building alone. Even the way that the voting space is arranged impacts whether and how people vote. If we just look at three variables, the presence of privacy dividers, booth spacing, and booth orientation, there are 12 possible options for the way one could configure a voting area. When booths are face-to-face, next to one another with no dividers, this is rated as particularly awful to use by voters. And that's contrasted with spaced out, divided, face-to-door orientations, which are ideal. In Illinois, expert space planners have come together to offer a guide for precincts to be able to orient the room based on its given size and shape to ensure voter privacy and just be a little less awful. This tactical method of supplying rules for people to follow rather than dictating exact arrangements for how each voter station should be laid out, that's the only way to be able to plan for this much space. There are about 3.8 million square miles of area in the United States in total. So if there were about 200,000 precincts in 2000, each one covers almost 20 square miles, or about a 2.5 mile radius. Within this area, it served on average 500 voters. But 20 years later, in 2020, there are about half as many precincts, so just shy of 100,000. That's one precinct within a 3.5 mile radius. Adding a mile of distance decreases someone's chance of voting by anywhere between 9 and 15%. Each precinct serves more land area and already more people, but it's also coupled by the fact that there are 1.5 times as many people voting in the 2000 election as in 2020. So each one of these serves about 1,500 people. Of course, that's at least partially made up for by the fact that there are other voting methods available today. Only 28% of voters voted in person on election day in 2020. But let's look at the breakdown of what kinds of buildings they're in. Based on that data from that 2000 study, 26% of people voted from a school. And here's the rest. 40% voted from a church, about 10% from a community center, and then the remaining 20% are scattered between public buildings and large private ones like hotels or senior centers. If voting from a school impacts how people vote, do any of these other building types do it too? Turns out, yeah, they do. More people vote from churches than from any other kind of building. And researchers measured how much the priming effect from voting in a church impacted outcomes in South Carolina during a series of elections in the early 2000s. The researcher, Abraham M. Rutchick, attempted to control for all the variables, but it's still likely a good idea to take this data with a bit of a grain of salt. But his study showed that people assigned to a church voted for the conservative Republican candidate 41% of the time, while people voting from other buildings voted for him 32% of the time. Being assigned to a church for voting led to a 9% difference in how people voted. To reiterate, this data accounts for things like people choosing to live in an area with lots of churches because they're religious. But Dr. Rutchick was skeptical, so he ran a few more studies. This time he tracked how people voted on a bill that would define marriage in a way that would exclude same-sex unions as being defined as marriage. This measure too, which aligns with the majority of conservative Christian values, was also more likely to be voted for from a church, regardless of their beliefs. Most precincts today limit polling from being done within the primary worshiping space, sticking instead with more generic community spaces inside of the building. But that priming effect has already been activated. So why do we allow this? In our scenario from 2000, that entire experience of our time at the high school, it cost taxpayers $10. That $10 went to the entire administrative apparatus for running the election, as well as the signage, the voting machines, and everything that transformed that gym into a voting place for that day. That seems like a lot of money, but also not a lot at the same time, because that's contrasted with the fact that candidates spent $16 billion in 2020 trying to get elected. There's about 8 times as much money going to sway you into voting a certain way than there is spent facilitating the collection of those votes in an unbiased way. And look, I am not sure what the right ratio is, but given the high stakes and scrutiny around the entire process, it seems important to look carefully at the spaces of voting as part of the entire system. So come this November, maybe just take note of what voting is like for you. Be aware of your surroundings, maybe track any of the challenges or obstacles that you face that maybe theoretically impact your level of access, usability, privacy, or maybe your confidence levels coming out of the process. And let's look at the spaces of our election so that we can make informed choices, so that we can get the most transparent version of democracy that we can get. How space affects our psychology is absolutely fascinating. If you think about it, we're always subject to things like priming from all the buildings that we're in. With voting, that may or may not be a strategic part of the process, but sometimes priming is certainly the reason for why a building is the way it is. For instance, when a designer wants to prompt certain behaviors for our own entertainment. That's the subject of my next video, and it's available to watch right now on Nebula 2 weeks before it drops on YouTube, and you can view it completely ad-free. In fact, if you only watch my videos from YouTube, you're missing out on a ton. I also post entirely unique videos like our building tours or interviews. Those are all Nebula too. I'll also be posting a sneak peek into my new studio space that I am so excited about and to be able to share. And it's all on Nebula, the streaming platform for high quality, engaging content. That's because we, the creators, have built it from the ground up so that it's tailor-made to provide the greatest viewing experience possible. Nebula simply offers the best proposition for both viewers like you and creators like me, because we believe in the value of what we're making, and we're investing in it to raise the bar for the over 150 creators that are a part of it. Hoog, Neo, Wendover Productions, all of your favorite creators are there. Some of them are partnering to produce entire shows that are exclusive to the platform. And we've added a ton more. My favorite is Neo's Underexposure, where Neo takes his inside world events in the most mesmerizing way possible that only Neo can do. You can gain access to all of this for 40% off by clicking the link that's on the screen right now, and it's also listed in the top of the description area. From there, you can sign up for whichever way makes sense for you. You could do it monthly, or annual, or even lifetime. And we also offer gift cards, which I think is a perfect way for friends or family to start learning a little bit more about architecture or, anything else that they may be into. So unlock the entire catalog of treasures of your favorite YouTubers and help me to continue sharing videos like this with my takes on the buildings that structure our world. See you over on Nebula. And as always, thanks for watching.